My name is Olivia Hart, and I spent the first part of my life learning that invisibility could feel heavier than any burden. From the outside, my childhood looked perfect, or as perfect as a small Pennsylvania town could appear. Neighbors waved from porches, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. During the holidays, our little one-story house sparkled with strings of gold and red garlands along the railings, a plastic reindeer glowing on the patchy lawn. From the street, it was cozy, cheerful, and stable, the kind of house that made outsiders believe in the American dream. But inside, it was a different world entirely, a world where my worth was measured not by who I was, but by how much I could endure without complaint. I was the responsible one. I don't remember anyone announcing it, at least not directly, but the expectations were clear. I made my bed before school, folded laundry without being asked, and learned exactly how long to leave the chicken in the oven, while my mother shouted instructions to my younger sister Sabrina, who was searching for her sparkly shoes. By the time I was 6, I could pack Sabrina's backpack, slice her apples, and braid her hair better than Mom ever did. I didn't notice the unfairness at first. I thought this was just how families worked. But looking back, I can see it now. I was treated like a tiny adult long before I stopped playing with crayons. Sabrina, on the other hand, was the princess. That word floated through our house as casually as the scent of Mom's vanilla candles. "Where's my princess?" Dad would call the moment he walked through the door. Even if I had spent the entire afternoon setting the table or carrying groceries from the car. Sabrina's slightest frown was met with soothing voices and gentle hugs, while my tears were brushed aside with a sigh or a reminder that life isn't always fair. When Sabrina and I fought over toys, space, or something as small as who got the bigger slice of cake, the blame always fell on me. "You're older," they said. "You should know better. Sabrina is sensitive." Sensitive became her shield, and strong became my prison. I remember one of the earliest moments when the unfairness burned its way into my memory. We were playing tag in the living room, even though we weren't supposed to. Sabrina bumped into me. I bumped into Mom's favorite ceramic vase, the tall cream-colored one with hand-painted blue flowers, and it shattered. Mom stormed in, eyes wide, and before I could explain, Sabrina started crying. Big, dramatic tears. Mom immediately knelt beside her, cooing, brushing her hair off her cheeks, asking if she was okay. I stood silently, heart pounding, realizing for the first time that my feelings didn't matter. When Sabrina sobbed, Olivia pushed me. Mom didn't question it. She turned to me with a sharp, disappointed stare and ordered me to clean up the mess carefully so I wouldn't cut myself. Meanwhile, Sabrina sniffled her way into Dad's arms, telling him I was mean. Not once did anyone ask if I was okay. Birthdays were another reminder of my place in the family. Mine were small, quiet affairs, sometimes a grocery store card signed at the last minute, a simple cake with 2 or 3 candles. My parents often came home late, tired, apologizing for not celebrating properly. "We'll make it up next year, sweetheart," they'd say, and they never did. Sabrina's birthdays, however, were productions. Banners, balloons, matching cups, pink explosions everywhere. Her friends would gather in the backyard, games and cotton candy everywhere, while I stood at the edge, helping Mom refill lemonade pitchers, passing out slices of cake, smiling quietly because that was my role. Stand aside, support, disappear. Dad repeated a phrase so often it became a mantra of my childhood. "You're strong, Olivia. Don't make a fuss. Your sister needs more attention. She's fragile." I heard it when Sabrina took my toys. I heard it when she ruined my school project. I heard it when I tried to tell them I felt left out. Each time, something inside me folded smaller, tighter, until I believed that needing comfort or love made me weak. Strength meant silent endurance. Strength meant invisibility. I don't think I understood the full weight of that belief until one winter night when I was 8 years old. I had a fever that made my entire body feel heavy and floaty at the same time. I curled up on the living room sofa, wrapped in a blanket, shivering. I waited for Mom to sit with me, to stroke my hair as she did for Sabrina whenever she sneezed once. But instead, Mom and Dad rushed around preparing Sabrina for her dance recital. Her tiny red costume glittered under the lights, her hair tied in a neat bun. Dad called, "Picture perfect!" and Sabrina twirled once, giggling. I tried to keep my eyes open, but my body felt leaden, my chest aching. When Mom finally noticed me on the sofa, she didn't scold, but she didn't comfort either. "We'll be back in a couple hours," she said. "There's soup in the fridge if you're hungry." And just like that, they were gone, leaving me alone with the heater's quiet hum, the dim light, and my own aching body. I must have fallen asleep waiting for them, but the memory stayed with me for decades. The quiet ache behind my eyes, the dim living room, the sense that when I needed someone, no one would come. By the time I could articulate my feelings, the truth was already ingrained. Strength was just another word for enduring alone. And so I practiced it, silently, without complaint, without anyone noticing. I learned to carry my own needs in secret, to hide my tears, to pretend that life's injustices didn't hurt me. High school arrived, and the labels my parents had assigned, strong and sensitive, hardened into the foundation of our family. I buried myself in schoolwork, volunteering, and part-time jobs. I dreamed quietly about helping people, about becoming someone who could see others the way no one had ever truly seen me. Sabrina drifted through her teen years, experimenting with rebellion, while our parents excused each mistake with a shrug, a sigh, and a whispered, "Girls will be girls." The defining moment of high school arrived on a rainy Wednesday evening. Sabrina had borrowed the family car without permission. Dad, protective as if it were a second child, ended up scraping the side of a parked vehicle. By the time she got home, shaking and babbling, Mom had gone pale, Dad pacing in circles. Then, almost in unison, they turned to me. "Olivia," Dad said, desperate, certain. "You need to tell the officer you were the one driving. Your sister can't afford to have this on her record. You're responsible. You can handle it." I wanted to say no. I wanted to scream, "Why is it always me?" But Sabrina's sobs drowned out my voice, and Mom whispered, "We can't let this ruin her future." I nodded. I lied. I said it was me who had borrowed the car, who misjudged the space, who panicked. That lie became an official note in a police report, a permanent bruise on my record. Sabrina, untouched and unscathed, peeked behind the living room curtain. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. No one thanked me. No one asked if I was scared. Dad simply clapped a hand on my shoulder. "That's why we can count on you," he said. In that moment, I wasn't a daughter. I was a shield, a tool, a solution. I learned then that my value was measured by my willingness to absorb pain, to take responsibility, to disappear behind the label of strong. And that label became my identity, shaping every action, every choice, every silent tear I would shed for decades to come. High school arrived like a quiet storm. The walls of my childhood home had already taught me the rules. Strength was silence, endurance was virtue, visibility was weakness. By the time I stepped into the halls of my high school, I carried those lessons like armor, though I didn't yet realize how heavy it was. While other teenagers complained about algebra homework or weekend boredom, my mind was occupied with subtler calculations. How could I help my family? How could I keep Sabrina safe from her own recklessness without my parents noticing the strain? How could I remain invisible enough to avoid criticism while still being responsible? Every day I threw myself into academics with an intensity that was equal parts devotion and desperation. I stayed up late at night, lamp glowing beside me, notebooks scattered across the floor, reading textbooks under the hum of a ceiling fan. Volunteering at the library became my sanctuary. Among the quiet shelves and dusty corners, I felt a semblance of control, a space where I wasn't constantly correcting someone else's mistakes or absorbing the emotional storms of my household. And yet, the tension of my home life never loosened its grip. Sabrina, meanwhile, seemed to float through her teenage years untouched. A broken curfew here, a minor altercation with a teacher there, each incident brushed away with a shrug from Mom or a muttered sigh from Dad. She changed her hair color every 2 weeks, bought outfits in colors I wouldn't dare wear, and drifted from one hobby to another with effortless charm. Every minor disaster she created seemed to fall at my feet. I cleaned up her messes quietly, internally counting each sacrifice as if to justify my continued invisibility. The first major incident that truly marked the weight of my responsibilities happened in the winter of my junior year. Sabrina had borrowed the family car, a tan Toyota Camry, without permission and ended up scraping the side of a parked vehicle in the grocery store lot. Dad paced in circles, desperate to contain the situation. Mom turned pale and whispered about ruined futures, and then, inevitably, they turned to me. "Olivia," Dad said, voice tight with both urgency and expectation, "you need to tell the officer it was you driving. Your sister can't afford this on her record. You're responsible. You can handle it." I remember standing in the hallway, rain dripping from the brim of my hat, heart hammering so loudly I was sure the officer would hear it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say, "Why is it always me?" But I didn't. Instead, I nodded. I lied. I told the officer I was the one driving. My misjudgment, my panic, my error, recorded officially, permanently. Sabrina, untouched and unharmed, peeked from behind the living room curtain. My chest ached with a mix of anger, sorrow, and an odd, confusing sense of duty. And afterward, nothing changed. No gratitude, no consolation. Just a hand on my shoulder, and the phrase I had come to know so well. "That's why we can count on you." It wasn't only accidents that taught me this lesson. Every day, every interaction seemed to reinforce it. I learned to carry the emotional weight of my family quietly, like a backpack stuffed with bricks. I helped friends, peers, and strangers because that was what I was good at: seeing need, absorbing it, and quietly shouldering it. Volunteering in the library, tutoring younger students, mentoring kids from troubled households, I felt alive there, needed, valued in ways that didn't exist at home. By senior year, the rhythm of my life had become precise, almost mechanical. Morning classes, afternoons at the library, evenings spent doing homework, and late-night volunteering at a community center. Every shift I took, every hour I spent, was a calculated move to survive, to excel, to earn small victories I could call my own. But the weight never left. College applications arrived as both opportunity and torment. I had discovered Ms. Parker, my school counselor years earlier, a woman whose kind eyes seemed to see straight into the invisible corners of my existence. She encouraged me to apply to schools out of state, to seek possibilities beyond the suffocating familiarity of Pennsylvania. Boston, she said, had programs that could prepare me to help people the way I longed to help them. But when I mentioned my plans to my parents, the air grew heavy immediately. "Boston," Dad repeated, disbelief dripping from every word. "Why so far away? You'll be leaving us." Mom's voice cut in, sharp and rehearsed. "Who's going to help out around here? Your sister can't handle things on her own." And just like that, the news of my potential future shrank into the background, swallowed by their ongoing emergencies. But I refused to shrink. For once, I refused to let someone else dictate the terms of my life. I filled out applications in the dead of night, fingers trembling over the keyboard, silently hoping for acceptance, for permission to exist beyond my assigned role. When acceptance letters arrived, the joy was immediate but fleeting. I had earned a partial scholarship to a university in Boston, financial aid to cover the rest, and permission to work while studying. The moment I told my parents, their responses were as predictable as they were crushing. Dad's voice dripped with concern over debt. Great, more loans. What if something happens here? What if your sister needs help? Mom's words followed, rehearsed and heavy with expectation. This is a lot, Olivia. Are you sure you're not doing too much? I wanted to laugh at the irony. The same people who had assigned me the title of strong from birth now criticized me for daring to be independent. But I simply said, yes, I'm sure. College life was not easy. Boston was a world away from Pennsylvania. Bigger, louder, faster, and unforgiving. I worked full-time at a community hospital, learned the rhythm of the espresso machine during early morning shifts, and spent every spare moment in the library studying, reading, absorbing knowledge like water. I lived on instant noodles, clearance bin vegetables, and coffee I made by accident at the cafe so I could drink it for free. I didn't go to parties. I didn't explore the city. Everything I earned, every ounce of energy I spent, went into surviving and building a life that was my own. But even in Boston, the invisible chains followed me. Money requests from my family arrived with a subtle, unavoidable weight. Dad's hours were cut? I sent $100. Sabrina couldn't pay her rent? I sent $200, sometimes borrowing from friends or skipping groceries to make it work. Each time I tried to push back, the familiar refrain played in my head. She's not strong like you, you're responsible. And each time I swallowed the resentment, as I had for years. There were days when the pride of helping felt meaningful. There were other days when my chest ached with anger, loneliness, and exhaustion. I watched my friends plan trips, buy new clothes, and explore the city while I rationed every dollar, every moment, every ounce of energy. Each sacrifice reinforced the lesson I had learned so young. Strength was endurance, invisibility was protection, and my needs came last. I started noticing my body protesting, fainting spells on the subway, dizzy spells during lectures, a persistent exhaustion that sleep could never cure. I told myself it was dehydration, stress, or lack of sleep. I told myself I didn't have time to be sick. I told myself people needed me. I told myself my family needed me. I had been trained to ignore the whispering warnings of my own body. Yet through all of this, something persisted. A quiet, stubborn spark. I had discovered the meaning of purpose outside my family's shadow. The teenagers I helped in crisis centers, the children I tutored at the library, the strangers who confided in me. They were reminders that my empathy and resilience could matter outside the walls of my family home. And slowly, I realized that perhaps strength wasn't only endurance for others. It could also be endurance for myself, for my dreams, for a life that was truly mine. The weight of responsibility had shaped me, molded me, and at times almost broken me. But it had also prepared me for the challenges ahead, for the decisions I would have to make, for the boundaries I would need to set. Little did I know, the moment of breaking, or awakening, was approaching. Boston was a city of possibility, a place that felt bigger, louder, and faster than the small Pennsylvania town I had left behind. It was also a place that demanded everything I had to give. Every morning, I woke before sunrise to work an opening shift at a local coffee shop, the dim light of the street lamps barely reaching the sidewalks as I tied my apron and listened to the hiss of the espresso machine. The aroma of roasted beans clung to my clothes, my hair, my very skin, and yet it felt like the first time in my life that I could breathe without constantly worrying about someone else's needs before my own. By 7:30, caffeine-fueled students rushed in, crumpled bills and cold coffee orders in hand, impatience radiating off them in waves. I poured their drinks with practiced efficiency, smiling and nodding even when my own hands shook from exhaustion. After my shift, I sprinted across the city to make it to morning lectures. My backpack bounced against my shoulder, heavy with textbooks, folders, and the quiet weight of responsibility I carried in every fiber of my being. Afternoons were spent at the library, reshelving books, sorting returns, and wiping down tables still sticky from late-night study sessions. The quiet of the stacks reminded me of childhood afternoons I had spent hiding from my own family's demands, tucked between the shelves, wishing for a place that was mine. Here, between dusty novels and the soft hum of fluorescent lights, I found a fragile sense of peace. I often imagined my younger self hiding here, finally discovering that she could be safe, even if just for a few hours. Evenings were for studying, nights for catching up on assignments, and weekends for extra shifts at a crisis hotline. I listened to trembling voices on the other end of the line, helping strangers navigate the edge of despair with soft, steady words. Perhaps I gravitated toward this work because I understood their pain all too well, the invisibility, the burden, the exhaustion of carrying more than your share of life. Despite the fragile independence I had carved out, my family's needs never stopped arriving like tidal waves. Dad called with stories of financial strain. Mom pleaded for assistance with bills. And Sabrina, well, she simply expected it. One week, her credit card maxed out. The next, her rent wasn't paid. I told myself it was only temporary, a one-time help. But it wasn't. Every mistake, every misstep, every moment of irresponsibility from Sabrina landed squarely at my feet. I learned to give without question, to sacrifice without acknowledgement, and to push my own needs aside until they became whispers, drowned out by louder crises. I remember the moment I first began questioning the fairness of it all. I was in my sophomore year at university, standing on the subway platform after another 12-hour shift. My legs felt like lead, my head spun with exhaustion, and my heart was so heavy I could barely breathe. I watched commuters rushing past me, heads down, earbuds in, entirely unaware of the silent collapse unfolding beside them. I felt a pang of jealousy for their normalcy, their freedom to prioritize themselves, to live without constant emotional debt. It started with fainting spells. One afternoon, during a lecture on social welfare policy, the room spun violently as I stood up to leave. My vision blurred, and the next thing I knew, I was on the cold tile floor, surrounded by concerned classmates. "Olivia, are you okay?" someone asked. I muttered something about dehydration and insisted I was fine, brushing off the incident as nothing. But my body was trying to tell me a truth I had ignored for years. The weight I carried was unsustainable. Weeks later, it happened again, this time on the bus on the way to work. The driver shook me gently awake, asking if I needed medical help. I insisted I was fine, convinced that admitting weakness was impossible. My mind was trained to prioritize everyone else, students, clients, family, before me. My body began to fracture under the pressure. I was living a life of quiet exhaustion, each act of care for others eroding the foundation of my own health. Work at the nonprofit reinforced both my purpose and my burden. I helped teenagers in crisis, families struggling with housing, and individuals who felt unseen by the world. It mattered to me in a way nothing else had, but it was also a reminder of the endless work of care I had done for my own family. Every story I heard reflected pieces of my own history: abandonment, invisibility, the quiet pain of being strong when no one noticed. I wanted more than survival. I wanted to grow, to learn, to help in deeper, more meaningful ways. I longed for clinical training, for a path that could give me the tools and knowledge to intervene more effectively, to lift others in ways I could only dream of during long nights at the library. One night, after a particularly grueling shift, I opened my laptop and began researching master's programs in clinical social work. Boston had some of the best in the country, and I was determined to apply. The news of my plans to pursue further education was met with immediate resistance. "More school?" Dad scoffed over the phone. "The family needs you. Your sister is still trying to find her footing." Mom added, "A master's isn't cheap, Olivia. We can't help you." The implication was clear. Pursuing my dreams outside of their convenience was selfish. They had expected me to sacrifice again, to step up yet another time, to be strong while shrinking the boundaries of my own life. But something inside me refused to shrink. Maybe it was the crisp, clear Boston air. Maybe it was the faces of the teenagers I helped every day, desperate for someone to see them. Maybe it was simply that I was tired, tired of giving pieces of myself away like loose change, tired of collapsing under the invisible weight of others' needs. I applied to 3 programs, and when acceptance arrived, I felt the strange mixture of triumph and terror. My life was finally mine, but claiming it meant defying the family expectations that had shaped me since childhood. I accepted a partial scholarship with the option to work while studying, and for the first time, I felt possibility. Yet even this freedom was complicated. The phone calls started almost immediately. Dad's hours were cut, the electric bill was late, Sabrina needed rent money again. And of course, I sent help because that was what I had been trained to do. Each act of generosity brought relief to them, but exhaustion and resentment to me. It was during these years that my body began whispering warnings I refused to hear. Fainting spells, dizzying headaches, fatigue so profound it became a constant hum in my chest. And yet I continued, driven by purpose and guilt, by the persistent lesson drilled into me since childhood. You are strong. You can endure anything. You are responsible. By the time I had completed my master's coursework and begun the clinical phase of my program, my life had become a carefully orchestrated chaos. Work at the hospital, classes, library shifts, crisis hotline shifts, and endless family obligations left me fragmented. My sense of self was stretched thin, woven between exhaustion, ambition, and the constant pull of old patterns. I was holding myself together for everyone, my students, my clients, my family. And somehow, I was expected to remain whole in the process. And then, it happened. The collapse that I had been both dreading and, secretly, anticipating. My master's graduation, the culmination of years of sacrifice, struggle, and quiet endurance, became the stage for the moment my body could no longer contain the pressure. Before I ever stepped onto the stage, I collapsed, unable to feel my own hands, unable to summon the energy to stand. Doctors rushed to my side, calling my parents, but they never answered. My sister posted a smiling photo at a backyard BBQ, captioned, "Family Day without the drama." That was the moment clarity broke through. Not pain, not shame, but understanding. I had spent my entire life trying to be enough for people who didn't see me, and in that moment, I finally chose to see myself. I realized that enduring alone had been my survival, but it didn't have to define the rest of my life. The breaking point had arrived, but it brought with it clarity, an awakening that would shape the choices I made from that day forward. The weeks after my collapse at graduation were a blur of hospital lights, sterile smells, and the quiet hum of monitors. Lying in a crisp hospital bed, I could feel my body slowly waking from the exhaustion that had accumulated over decades. Nurses checked my vitals, doctors scribbled notes, and for the first time in years, someone asked, "How are you?" without expecting me to fix everything else in the world first. I had never realized how heavy I had been carrying my family, my clients, and my responsibilities until the moment I was forced to let go. And as I lay there, the truth crystallized with painful clarity. I had been living for everyone else, and in doing so, I had neglected myself entirely. It was an uncomfortable truth. I loved my family. I cared deeply for the teenagers I supported, for the children I tutored, for the strangers who confided in me at the hotline. But love did not have to mean self-destruction. Caring did not mean erasing myself. For the first time, I began to imagine life on my terms, not dictated by guilt, obligation, or expectation. The first step was boundaries. That was a word I had never learned growing up. Boundaries were foreign territory, like a language I didn't speak. But now, lying in a hospital bed, I realized that if I continued to bend endlessly for others, I would collapse again. And this time, the consequences could be far worse. The calls from my family began almost immediately. Dad, his voice tight with concern, or was it irritation, asked, "Are you okay, Olivia? When can you come home?" Mom, anxious and clipped, said, "Sabrina needs you. We can't manage without you." And Sabrina, ever dependent, texted, "Liv, can you send me some money? Rent is due." I stared at the phone for what felt like hours. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, and then I typed something that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. "No. I'm recovering. I need to focus on myself right now." I didn't make excuses. I didn't justify my decision. I simply refused. It was a small act of rebellion at first, but it carried enormous weight. I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly with every refusal, every no I said without guilt. It was not easy. Guilt clawed at me relentlessly, the kind I had internalized since childhood. But with every boundary, I felt a piece of myself return, a quiet reclaiming of the person I had been too busy surviving to notice. Therapy became my next step. I had spent years helping others navigate trauma, crisis, and emotional chaos. Yet I had never applied those tools to my own life. Sitting across from a therapist for the first time, I felt awkward and vulnerable. But slowly, layer by layer, I began to unravel the patterns that had governed my existence for decades. I spoke about the favoritism, the expectations, the constant pressure to be strong. I spoke about Sabrina, about my parents, about the countless moments of invisibility. And for the first time, I wasn't silenced. My words mattered. My pain mattered. The therapist helped me identify the deep-seated beliefs I had internalized, that my needs were secondary, that love was measured in sacrifice, that weakness was unacceptable. Together, we began the work of dismantling those beliefs, brick by brick. It was exhausting, terrifying, and liberating all at once. Meanwhile, I started to restructure my professional life. I loved my work at the nonprofit, but I realized I could no longer give everything to everyone without burning out. I reduced my hours, shifted some responsibilities, and learned to say no when a task was beyond my limits. It felt revolutionary. Saying no had been impossible for so long that the act itself was almost dizzying. But with each refusal, my confidence grew. I was learning that my energy, my time, and my well-being were valuable. At the same time, I faced my family again, but this time with a new perspective. When Dad called, expecting me to swoop in and fix a new emergency, I calmly explained, "I'm focusing on my health and my future right now. I can't take on more responsibility at the moment." Mom, predictably, responded with shock and thinly veiled criticism. "This is selfish, Olivia. You're being selfish." But I held firm. I no longer needed their approval to justify my choices. Sabrina was the hardest. She had become so accustomed to my support that my refusal felt like betrayal. She cried, yelled, and tried to guilt me, invoking every familiar refrain I had heard since childhood. "You're strong. You should be able to handle this. I can't do it without you." I didn't engage in arguments. I didn't apologize. I simply said, "I'm done being your safety net. You can manage, and I will help when I am able, on my terms." It was painful, but necessary. Through this process, I discovered the immense power of self-respect. It wasn't just a concept, it was a practice. I set limits, prioritized my well-being, and invested in my own growth. I pursued opportunities to deepen my clinical skills, explored new job roles, and dedicated time to self-care, long walks along the Charles River, evenings spent reading in the quiet of my apartment, and moments of stillness where I simply breathed without guilt. Financial independence became another cornerstone of control. I worked tirelessly to ensure that I could meet my own needs without relying on family contributions. Budgeting, saving, and planning for the future gave me a sense of agency I had never felt before. Each time I refused to send money immediately, each time I prioritized my own bills and student loans, I reinforced a boundary I had long denied myself the right to set. I also began to rebuild relationships that had been neglected. Friends who had been patient with my endless availability now saw a more balanced version of me. I learned to accept help from others without shame, to delegate tasks at work, and to ask for support when I was overwhelmed. For the first time, I felt like a partner in my own life, rather than the unpaid laborer for everyone else. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. There were relapses, moments of guilt, waves of anxiety, and times when I questioned whether I was being cruel for prioritizing myself. But gradually, the clarity I had glimpsed during that collapse solidified into conviction. I was not responsible for everyone else's happiness. I was not obligated to fix every problem. I was allowed to exist for myself. The most profound change was internal. I no longer defined myself solely by my strength or my ability to endure. I was learning to embrace vulnerability, to acknowledge needs, to allow imperfection. Strength, I realized, was not the absence of weakness. It was the courage to claim your own life, even when others expect you to remain invisible. By the end of the year, I had rebuilt my life on these principles. I had returned to the nonprofit with renewed energy, reduced my hours, and mentored new staff in a way that modeled boundaries and self-care. I had declined multiple requests from my family, not out of cruelty, but from a place of self-preservation and clarity. And slowly, they began to adjust, reluctantly at first. Then with growing recognition that I was no longer a tool for their convenience. For the first time in decades, I felt free. Not entirely unburdened, but liberated enough to make choices that honored my needs and aspirations. The collapse that had once felt like failure had become a catalyst, a turning point that forced me to see the life I had been avoiding. I discovered that taking control wasn't just about saying no, it was about saying yes to myself. And in that reclamation, I found a quiet, profound joy. The kind of joy that comes not from approval, attention, or reward, but from knowing that you are standing firmly in your own truth, unshaken by the expectations or judgments of others. I had spent a lifetime being strong for everyone else. Now, I was finally strong for me. The first days of real freedom were almost disorienting. After decades of living in the shadows of my family's needs and expectations, I had to remind myself that the world didn't stop if I prioritized myself. The early mornings still existed, my coffee shop shift, the commute, the hustle of university. But now, they were mine, chosen, intentional. The weight of obligation that had once crushed my chest had lifted just enough to let me breathe. I learned that freedom didn't mean chaos, it meant choice. For the first time, I could say no without shame, prioritize my own health, and cultivate a life that reflected my values rather than someone else's convenience. I enrolled in my final semester of the master's program with a clarity I had never known. Assignments, clinical hours, and research projects no longer felt like an endless chain of obligation. They were steps toward a future I had actively chosen, a future where I mattered. Self-care became a deliberate practice. I bought a small journal and wrote every night, pouring out the tangled emotions that had built up over decades. I walked the Boston streets in the early morning light, letting the air fill my lungs and the rhythm of my steps remind me that my body was mine, not a vessel for someone else's burdens. I began to cook meals for myself, small acts of nourishment that felt revolutionary. I realized that caring for oneself was not selfish, it was essential. Therapy continued to play a pivotal role in my recovery. Together, my therapist and I worked through the trauma of my upbringing, unpacking years of favoritism, emotional neglect, and unfair expectations. I explored the deep-seated guilt that had driven me to sacrifice endlessly and learned strategies to reclaim my autonomy without fear. Each session left me feeling lighter, more anchored in my own truth. I no longer defined myself by the weight of others' needs. I defined myself by my choices, my resilience, and my ability to love without losing myself. Family remained a challenge. Dad continued to call with minor emergencies, and Mom's voice carried the same anxious undertone as always. Sabrina's requests for money continued, though I responded differently now. I had set clear financial boundaries. I was willing to help, but only on terms that didn't jeopardize my well-being. When Sabrina called about a rent emergency, I said, "I can help this time, but moving forward, you need to manage your finances independently." It was uncomfortable for her at first, but necessary for both our sakes. The more I asserted my independence, the more I discovered my own strength. I had feared that setting boundaries would sever connections, but instead, it clarified relationships. Some family members resisted, some were hurt, but the truth of my needs was undeniable. I realized that love should not require self-erasure, that it was possible to care for others while still honoring oneself. At work, I embraced new opportunities. My supervisor noticed my dedication and offered me a leadership role in the clinical department. I hesitated at first, wary of taking on too much, but I accepted with a newfound sense of balance. This time, I would define the limits, delegate responsibilities wisely, and ensure that my energy was respected. The teens I worked with responded to my authentic presence. They could sense the difference between someone who was exhausted, resigned, and someone who was empowered, intentional, and grounded. I also began mentoring younger colleagues, teaching them not only clinical skills, but also the importance of self-care and boundaries. I shared the lessons I had learned the hard way, that compassion should never come at the expense of one's own health, that saying no is an act of courage, and that it is possible to love without losing oneself. Watching them grow and flourish, knowing I had helped them avoid the traps I had fallen into, filled me with a quiet pride I had never experienced before. Outside of work, I invested in building a life that reflected my values. I joined a small book club, reconnecting with the joy of literature I had loved as a child. I explored Boston's hidden streets, small cafes, and quiet parks. I allowed myself moments of joy without guilt, sipping a latte while reading poetry, walking along the river at dusk, lingering in art galleries for hours. These were luxuries I had denied myself for years, but now they were non-negotiable acts of self-respect. Financial independence became more than a necessity, it became empowerment. I saved diligently, created a budget that reflected my priorities, and began investing in my future. No longer was I dependent on family contributions or beholden to their whims. Each dollar I earned was a reinforcement of my agency, a declaration that my life was mine to shape. One quiet evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I remembered the small living room in Pennsylvania, the cold winter nights, the birthdays overshadowed by my sister's extravagance, the car incident, the constant lessons of, "Be strong, Olivia, don't make a fuss." I realized that strength had not been about endurance alone, it had always been about survival. But now, strength had taken on a new meaning: courage, self-respect, and the ability to claim my life without apology. I began to forgive, not in a way that condoned past behavior, but in a way that released me from its hold. I forgave my parents for their favoritism, my sister for her dependence, and most importantly, I forgave myself for believing that my worth was defined by what I could give, rather than who I was. Forgiveness was not weakness, it was liberation. By the time I walked across the stage at my master's graduation, months after my collapse, I did so with a sense of power I had never known. The applause, the diploma, the recognition, they were meaningful, but they were not the source of my triumph. The real victory was internal. I had survived the years of invisibility, of expectation, of self-sacrifice. I had learned to honor my own needs, reclaim my autonomy, and embrace the life I had chosen. The future was no longer a burden of obligation. It was a landscape of possibilities, shaped by my own decisions, tempered by experience, and fueled by a resilient heart. I knew challenges would come, that moments of doubt and exhaustion were inevitable. But I also knew that I now possessed the tools, the boundaries, and the self-respect to navigate life on my terms. Healing was a continuous process. It required vigilance, patience, and compassion for oneself. But I had discovered that the journey itself was transformative, that claiming your life, even in small ways, could ripple outward to reshape everything. I could help others without losing myself. I could love without erasing my identity. I could be strong, not by enduring invisibly, but by standing fully, boldly, and unapologetically in my own truth. And so, for the first time, I truly felt free. Not free from responsibility, not free from life's challenges, but free from the chains of expectation that had bound me since childhood. Free to exist, to choose, to flourish. Free to be Olivia Hart, visible, valued, and whole. The collapse that had once threatened to break me had become the pivot upon which my life turned. It was no longer the end of me. It was the beginning of everything I was meant to be.